In the bitter grip of January 1945, Amsterdam had become a city of silence and shadows. The once lively streets were now muted, each footfall muffled by snow and desperation. In a fourth-floor apartment in the Kinkerstraat district, a young woman named Elizabeth Vandermeer knelt beside a piano stool, her hands trembling from cold and hunger. With a crack that echoed like a gunshot in the stillness, the stool's legs splintered beneath her weight. It wasn't music that came from her grandmother's piano now, but firewood. The snapped mahogany would mean 10 more precious minutes of warmth, 10 minutes where the shaking in her bones might subside. The sounds of Amsterdam had changed. Tram bells and cafe laughter had vanished. In their place came the scraping of wood, the coughing of the sick, and the slow drag of death carts through the snow. The hunger winter wasn't the result of battlefield chaos. It was the outcome of a calculated decision by the Nazi occupiers. In September 1944, following a call from the Dutch government in exile for a nationwide railway strike to support the Allies' Operation Market Garden, 30,000 railway workers bravely vanished from their posts. The goal was to cripple German logistics, but Market Garden failed. The Allied thrust halted short of Arnhem. The Germans retaliated against the Dutch with brutal precision. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Reich's commissioner for the Netherlands, responded not with bullets, but with bureaucracy. He issued a decree banning all food and fuel shipments to the western provinces, cutting off Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague from supply. It was siege warfare by starvation. With canals frozen and railways idle, the cities were turned into traps. By November, the bread ration had dwindled to almost nothing. By January, bread itself was a memory. Calories became a currency more valuable than gold. Elizabeth, like millions around her, lived for the next bite. Each morning began with the ache of hunger in her stomach and the ache of cold in her bones. She wore every garment she owned and walked miles for a ladle of watery beet soup, a gruel barely enough to sustain a child, let alone an adult. The grand trees of the Vondelpark had vanished, chopped down for fuel. People boiled tulip bulbs for hours to make them edible. The city turned in on itself. Doorframes, floors, and furniture all fed into the desperate fires of survival. Each morning, men dragged carts through the streets, not to collect trash, but the bodies of those who hadn't made it through the night. The horses once used for transport had long since been eaten. People no longer died in hospitals. They died in their beds, in alleyways, alone. By March, over 20,000 had succumbed to starvation or exposure. Elizabeth was wasting away. Her limbs were swollen, her skin split, her body consuming itself from the inside. She hadn't felt true hunger in weeks, only an endless exhaustion. Yet beyond the frozen rivers, another army stirred. On Walcheren Island, Corporal Tom Brick Moffat of the Black Watch Royal Highland Regiment of Canada pressed himself into mud, bullets snapping overhead. The Canadians were fighting a different kind of war, a brutal battle for control of the Scheldt estuary. Antwerp, the port that could supply the Allies, was useless until its waterways were secured. The Germans, entrenched in concrete bunkers, had turned the island into a death trap. The Canadians called themselves the Water Rats, slogging through waist-high floodwaters, soaked and frozen, but well-fed compared to those suffering just 60 miles to the north. They heard rumors from Dutch resistance fighters, whispers of cities cut off, of children starving, of entire neighborhoods devoured by famine. But the Canadians' reality was immediate and lethal. Every hedgerow might conceal a sniper, every shell crater a death trap. Moffat's rations included meat and vegetables, tea and biscuits, chocolate and cigarettes. What he found bland and boring was, to the Dutch, the stuff of dreams. In February, as Operation Veritable ground through the Reichswald forest in Germany, the hunger winter reached its nadir. The food kitchens in Amsterdam closed. The last bulbs had been eaten. The canals froze over, turning the city into a tomb. Elizabeth no longer got out of bed. She and her mother clung to each other beneath blankets, too weak to speak. Her body, just 82 pounds, had become a shell. The water pumps were dry. The electric grid had collapsed. The silence was total. Then came April. Canadian tanks broke through to the North Sea, liberating towns as they pushed toward the heart of the Netherlands, but then they stopped. In front of them stood Fortress Holland, still held by 250,000 German soldiers. General Charles Foulkes of the Canadian First Corps faced an unthinkable dilemma: attack and risk the annihilation of cities like Amsterdam, or wait. Seyss-Inquart threatened to blow the dikes if the Allies advanced, flooding the country in one final act of madness. Instead of assaulting, negotiations began. Allied commanders sent word: surrender now, or face war crimes trials. Seyss-Inquart agreed to a truce of sorts. Food would be allowed in, but no Allied troops would enter. The first miracle came from the skies. On April 29th, Operation Manna began. Hundreds of RAF Lancaster bombers flew low over Holland, dropping thousands of burlap sacks filled with food. Army rations, flour, chocolate, and canned goods rained from the sky. Elizabeth heard the roar of engines and prepared for death, but instead of bombs, salvation fell. Yet many were too weak to reach the drop sites. Others died from eating too quickly. It was hope, but not enough. What came next changed everything. The Canadians launched Operation Faust. This time, the Allies would enter, not as conquerors, but as couriers. On May 2nd, the first food convoy rumbled through German lines. Private Jack Collins, a truck driver from Guelph, Ontario, led the way. His canvas-covered CMP truck carried thousands of pounds of rations. As he rolled past German sentries who just days earlier would have shot him, he saw what war had done. The Dutch civilians along the roads weren't waving or cheering. They were skeletal, draped in rags, silent as ghosts. Jack saw a woman holding a child with a swollen head and twig-thin limbs. He couldn't bear it. He reached for his personal chocolate bar, the one he'd saved, and threw it from the truck window. The woman flinched. Then she sobbed. Around her, others wept, not from joy, but disbelief. Soldiers, grizzled men who'd fought in the mud of Ortona and the forests of Germany, broke down. They emptied their pockets, their ration bags, their hearts. Tins of stew, army biscuits, cigarettes, all thrown to the starving in a spontaneous act of compassion that would never be forgotten. On May 5th, the German commander in the Netherlands formally surrendered. The war was over. 2 days later, Amsterdam erupted, not in violence but in jubilation. The Canadians entered to a roar unlike anything they'd heard. Flags that had been hidden under floorboards were unfurled. The color orange, banned under the Nazis, flooded the streets. Elizabeth, once too weak to move, was now in the city square, leaning on strangers, laughing, crying, singing. Jack drove his truck into the heart of the celebration, kissed on the cheek by strangers, handed wooden shoes by old men, weeping as he tossed boxes of food into the crowd. Canadian soldiers, hardened by war, were lifted into the air by people who saw them not as warriors, but as angels. Flowers were stuffed into the barrels of rifles. Bread, real bread, baked by mobile field kitchens, filled the air with a sense so powerful it made people cry. For the first time in months, the Dutch could eat, live, breathe. The Royal Canadian Army Service Corps turned warehouses into food depots. Field kitchens sprang up in every neighborhood. The sounds of Amsterdam were no longer of hunger, but of clinking spoons, of boiling pots, of laughter. Elizabeth held a steaming mug of stew in her hands, her fingers trembling not from cold, but disbelief. She bit into soft white bread and cried, not because of what was lost, but because of what had returned. In the end, it wasn't just the battles won or the gun silence that defined the Canadian role in the Netherlands. It was this: a soldier's chocolate bar tossed from a truck, a loaf of bread given with a smile, a convoy that didn't bring tanks but life. The hunger winter had ended, and with it the long dark night of Nazi occupation. What remained was a promise, etched in the hearts of the Dutch people, that they would never forget the Canadians who didn't just fight for freedom but delivered it.